So thank you so much for joining us. I'm Pete Burden, and I'm your host today on the Healthy Power Alliance podcast. We're using this space to explore what it means to be powerful together, to look at how human power, particularly as it appears in organizations and communities, can benefit other humans and the planet we all depend upon. We're speaking to people who are in the middle of doing that, people who think they know how to do it from the outside, and people who are doing in-depth academic studies of what really works and probably what doesn't work as well. We love theory, but we're mostly interested in practice. So I'm very pleased to have Bob Eggington with me today. We've known each other for a while, but we haven't seen each other for a while. So lovely to have you here, Bob.
Yeah, thank you for asking me.
Great. And I'll just, if it's okay, I'll just say a few words um, about what I know about you, and you can correct me and fill in any gaps. But my understanding is that you originally trained as a journalist and worked on, I imagine, city newspapers and then national newspapers before joining the BBC. I think you also worked for a news agency, perhaps at some point, and then you joined the BBC and had a long career with the BBC. Which I'd be very interested to hear more about. And then, but since about 2000, I guess, you've been working um, mainly, as I understand it, as someone from the media, helping other media organizations kind of develop and improve all over the globe. And you've also worked, gathering as a consultant for various organizations like the Wellcome Trust and so forth. And indeed, so you're some kind of advisor to the UK government or have been around media or something like that. Perhaps you could correct me or fill in some of those gaps.
Yeah, that's mostly right. I started working on a weekly newspaper in Leicestershire as a trainee reporter in 1969,
Mhm.
and I thought about this on Saturday when I bought the Saturday newspaper, which was £4.50, and I remember my first wage was £4 18 shillings a week on a newspaper in 1969. So you you can more or less buy one newspaper for what I was paid uh, in a week when I started work on the Colville Times in Leicestershire,
Blimey.
which was great. And I went from there to an agency in Leicester, which was a big step up and a big change for me because you were working for the national newspapers, but also the agency was doing the news, providing the news for the local radio station, BBC Radio Leicester.
Mhm.
There were only three local radio stations, BBC stations in that time, and none of them had their own newsrooms. It seems odd now, but they bought in the news from agencies in the city. So we did the news for Radio Leicester. And after that, I liked broadcasting. I liked the BBC, and I drifted into the BBC and local radio, then to national radio, and then, as you say, very long time in the BBC, 30 years. And then the thing you missed out is that, because I never told you about it, is that in the early 2000s, I was involved in two software startups, both of which were quite successful. It didn't make us a lot of money, it made us some money, but not internet money.
Mhm.
And also doing the media development stuff around the world that you talked about. And yeah, I've had some consultancy gigs with the Foreign Office, Food Standards Agency, Reuters, the Wellcome Trust, and others I can't remember now. But that's basic. So I'm in my 57th year in journalism. My wife tells me not to tell anybody about this because then they'll realize she's married to an old man. But that's it. 57 years. Yeah. But
Lovely.
56 years going into 57. Yeah.
Lovely. Thank you. That's really good to hear. So, I want to ask you about power and your first experiences of power and how you understand it. But let me just say for the audience as well, I mean, we're using a very simple definition of power, which is this idea that power is the thing that helps you get your needs met or achieve your goals. And then by healthy power, what we mean is doing that in such a way and the practice of doing that in such a way that increases other people's power as well. So it's the complete opposite of toxic power, which is often seen as taking power away from other people to achieve our goals. So, with that kind of definition in mind, or any definition, in fact, I mean, how did you when did you first discover that there was power operating in the world, if you did discover it?
Um, well, I think with the caveat that I've learned that memory is not entirely to be trusted. I think that I first became aware of it in primary school because I think
Mm,
when I was growing up at home before school, your parents have all the power, of course, and as a child, that's the way it is, and you accept that. And my parents were great, I had no problems with them exercising power uh, over us. It wasn't an issue. And then at secondary school, primary school, um, I realized, though I couldn't have put it this way, that the control system was essentially fear, that if you did anything wrong, you were caned by the head teacher.
mhm,
And so, obviously one doesn't like to be afraid. But I didn't basically resent um, the fact that I was at school. In fact, I rather enjoyed it, especially the games and playing with my mates in the playground and all of that. And then I suppose when I became much more conscious of power was in secondary school, which I quickly disliked almost entirely. And I resented the fact that it got in the way of life, that, and I formed a low and bad opinion of my teachers. I thought they were probably time servers who were just being teachers because they had long holidays and short working days, and they could keep us under control and then get off at the end of the day. And anyway, this was stupid and ungenerous and wrong thing to think, but I disliked education
mhm,
quite strongly, and I disliked the power that the system had over me to make me go in every day. So
mhm,
I didn't want to continue with education after school. I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had a few dead end jobs, like as a labourer and a clerk and working on a market stall, and I resented work. Actually, I needed to work. I wanted the money from work, but so I resented the fact that I had to go to work because that also impinged on life.
mhm,
And then uh, out of the blue, my girlfriend at the time pointed out this advertisement for a trainee reporter on the Colville Times, and I applied for it and got it. And I'd always liked writing, and I thought mistakenly that journalism was about writing, which it is to a very limited extent. It's basically writing to formula rather than creative writing. But anyway, I went there, and it started to fall in my relationship with power. That's I didn't think about it this way at the time, but
of
that's
course.
that's when it started to make sense to me.
And what did you discover then when you first went into the workforce then about power? Because presumably there's power still operating. There was a
Yeah,
chief editor or something, or
yeah, that was yeah. Well, the thing was, first they sent me out on my first story in the first week that I was there, and I went on the bus to Ashby de la Zouch and interviewed a young woman, not much older than me. There, came back, I wrote my story, and I sent it to the editor. And after a while, he called me down and he said, "This woman, her name is Carol, is it?" I said, "Yeah, that's right, Carol." And he said, uh, "You spelled her name Carole." I said, "Yeah, yeah." He said, "Why did you spell her name that way?" I said, "Well, because that's how you spell Carol." He said, "That's one way to spell Carol." He said, "There are other ways to spell Carol. Did you ask her how she spelled her name?" And I said, No, no, I didn't ask her." He said, "Well, go back and ask her." He said, and he said, "On this newspaper, we don't get names wrong." He said, for some people, the name is the only thing they've got. And
Mhm,
in this newspaper, we do not get names wrong. And if you get names wrong, there will be no job for you on this newspaper, you know?
mhm.
So I thought, blimey, this is this is very clear. And it made sense to me, He said, I've got to be accurate. And I got on the bus and went back, and I had spelled her name correctly, but that wasn't the point.
Yeah.
So here I thought, okay, this just makes sense to me. I've got to be accurate. If I'm not accurate, um, I'll be out of a job. you know.
And did you like, was it the clarity you liked then in that
Yeah,
case?
the clarity. And then
Mm.
after a few months, there were four of us journalists in the reporters' room. It was upstairs, out of everybody else's way, and it came out. It was a weekly paper, and on Fridays you didn't have much to do because the paper had come out. You know,
Mhm.
you get a few things ready for next week's paper, like the chemist's rota, what's on at the local cinema, and what happened 50 years ago in the news, you know, all that kind of stuff. But basically, you could go for lunch and relax a bit. And it came out that they didn't know how to play bridge, but there were four of us. So I taught them how to play bridge. We had some cards, and so we started playing bridge, and they all loved it, of course. So next week we come in, and instead of going out getting stories, we're playing bridge whenever we can, you know. And it got to by Wednesday lunchtime, you're supposed to have 40 galleys. Do you know what a galley is in printing?
Yes, vaguely, yes.
In printing, you know, it's a long
Yes,
strip of
printing thing, yeah.
paper, a single column width, and everything is
Hmm.
printed out on a galley for checking. You know,
Hmm.
we're supposed to have 40 galleys by Wednesday lunchtime. I think we got about 18 or something. And the chief reporter got called down, and he came back up and he said, "Look, this is a big problem. The editors told me that we're in danger of not getting the paper out because we've not been working hard enough. And somehow or other, he knows that it was you, and he pointed at me, who was mainly responsible for this. Said, so unless we have 40 galleys by tomorrow morning, somebody's going to be fired, starting with you." And he pointed at me, you see. So I thought, golly, and so we started work furiously, and we had 45 galleys by the end of the day, and this made sense to me too, because it said, yeah, you can come here and you have a certain amount of latitude you're not chained to a desk, you're not working machine, you have some control over how you spend your time, but there are some things you've just got to do. First of all, you've got to be accurate and you've got to be productive.
Mm.
And I thought this makes sense to me,
Mm.
and so I loved it, you know.
Mm.
I had a great time, and I've had a great time ever since, And I don't. I think the clarity, and it's not just clarity because it's clarity with something that makes sense to you. That's the point,
Mm.
Makes sense.
Okay.
It's clear. This is how you. So that's, you know.
It's kind of yeah, in psychological terms, kind of boundaries or something like that really, really helps. Um, jump forward a little bit if you can. So at that time you were way down the pile and there were chiefs above telling you what to do. Then you kind of went to the BBC and you worked in the BBC for a long time. And I kind of imagine that you worked your way up. So firstly, how did you work your way up and how did you navigate power as you did that? And then what was it like when you started to have power over other people as well, I guess?
Okay. Well, I mean, the way I think about this is that when you're a child, um, it's basically your parents' world and your teacher's world. I think this is a bit, watching how my grandchildren and other children around are brought up. This is changing, attitudes to parenting and the way children's world is changing. But in those days, it was your parents' world and your teacher's world, And then when you first go to work, it's your employer's world. They have all the power over you. But as you, with a bit of luck, progress in your work, you start to acquire a bit of power, as you put it, to yourself, and it starts to become your world too. And then you retire, and it's somebody else's world.
Again, yeah.
And you're no longer part. I guess this is to do with what I'm saying. I suppose is to do with the having a place in the economy.
Hmm.
Really, and feeling that you've earned your place in the economy. So I started work when I was in the radio newsroom in Broadcasting House in London when I was 22. So I was very young. And it all came rather easily to me, journalism, and it didn't really feel like work, actually, because I knew what to do. I thought I wouldn't say I was the best at it, but I was pretty good at it, and I just enjoyed it. And then working night shift one night, the person in charge would give you a bunch of copy, meaning, agency copy of stories. They wanted you to write a story for the morning and maybe give you some tape of a reporter's correspondence or something. You make a story. And I just used to read the copy and dictate. You couldn't type You couldn't type yourself in the BBC in those days. You know, there'd have been a strike. You had to dictate to typists. So, and I dictate my stories and then, sit down and read the paper or something. And I saw this colleague of mine sitting at his desk, and he got all his copy in front of him, and he got a notebook, and he was reading through it and making notes. And this is the first time I realized that journalism could be quite hard work, you
Okay.
know. And I thought, well, if he does that, although I think I'm better journalist than he is, I'm going to end up working for that guy, which I didn't want to happen. And so that was when I realized I might start having to put a bit of effort into it, and and I did, and I did, start to get promoted, and eventually, which I think is what happens, and I think I've spoken to you about this in the past. You get to a point when you're getting promoted because you're good at what you do, and then they promote you to do something else, and you end up in management. So that's the second part of what you asked me to talk about, right?
Yeah.
How you end up. Um, so
And just to check then, so in that earlier stage, you're seeing the world as quite competitive or something like that. Is that right? So you're seeing this other person and you don't want them on top of you, so you're kind of working your way up.
yeah, I mean, there's no great insight on my part. I was just
Oh,
noticing the obvious.
sure.
And I suppose I could a lot of journalists are very similar to me, similar type of people, and a lot of them are quite content to carry on doing the job that comes easily to them and having fun, you know.
Mm,
Um, but I didn't want to do that, and uh, I'd read I read a lot, and I'd read a lot about journalism, and I'd read a lot of memoirs of people who'd risen to distinction in journalism, including Arthur Christensen, who was the famous editor of the Daily Express, and Hugh Cudlip, who ran the Mirror and other newspapers. And I was attracted to, although I didn't know the term for it, editorial management. And that's really what and I think in the end, that's what ended up being my forte,
mhm,
because I can write stories for
mhm,
in the style of any major news outlet that you want, but
mhm,
I like, I was drawn towards editorial management, and uh, the thing I liked best about it was organizing the coverage, you know.
mhm,
And
mhm.
so sometime in the 80s, I became a manager, I suppose.
Mm. So then you're in a role where you're kind of organizing things and organizing people.
Yeah,
So you're now exerting
yeah.
kind of power, and you're still trying to bring the same kind of clarity. Again, I'm interested in your kind of emerging practice as you became a manager and all of that. How did you go about it as a manager?
Well, I think probably clumsily,
Of course, yeah.
because there probably are uh, people who know what to do instinctively, but I think there are far more people who uh, have to learn, and
Hmm.
you do, as Bill Gates said, success is a very poor teacher, you learn by your mistakes. And uh, what happened to me was I was often given in the BBC uh, jobs where the first thing was to sort out something that was going wrong. You know, same thing with BBC News Online. This happened to
Hmm.
me lots of times, and um, that's the sort of downside of management, really. And you have to management's not easy because you have to say difficult things to people that you'd rather not say, really. In polite society, if you met them in the pub and you thought, they were probably a wally, you wouldn't tell them, but when you're managing people in a performance environment, um, you've got to say difficult things to them. You've got to find a way of doing it. And the thing that interests me most about all of this is slightly tangential to what you're interested in, is that I realize that um, you can only get through to people if they're ready to hear whatever it is you want to say to them. You know, if you need to say something difficult to somebody and you sit them down and you say, now look, I'm telling you something that's very important, there's very high chance that you won't get through to them because they're not ready, you know. And so, and you can't really know what people are ready to hear either, you know. So it's very tricky. And I learned this really in fairly early days when I was a news editor in local radio. And I was working in Derby. And I had contact in the Crown Court system. And he rang me up one morning and he said, hey, you know that murderer, this person who'd been accused? I said, yeah. He said, well, he was in the dock. It was a hot sunny day. And he said somebody had left the window open behind him. He jumped out and he escaped from his trial. You know, oh God, right. Okay, but get somebody over there, you know. So there was only one reporter available. So I called her over and I said, look, this is what's happened. I told her what happened. I said, and you could see the Crown Court through my office window. So that, you know, that's the Crown Court over there. This is what's happened. Get over there, get your recorder, and interview everybody you can find, anybody you saw about it. You know, don't worry too much about the facts. Get descriptive stuff. And she got all flustered. She said, "Oh yeah, okay, okay." I said, "You know, where is it?" And I kept answering the question. She said, "And where is the court?" I said, "I just pointed to you. I just told you where the court is." I said, "It's right there." I said, "Now get over there and stop playing the dumb brunette." You know, and so this was me losing my temper. Right, I'm not proud of this, but so she skulked off, and she came back and she did the story. And the next morning, I went in first, earliest. And she came in early and she came up to me and she said, I just want you to know that I'm going to stop playing the dumb brunette. And I said, oh, I'm sorry I said that. You know, I was just under pressure and I was rude. She said, no, no, no. She said, you're absolutely right. She said, I've been feeling inferior and I've been trying to cover it up by pretending to be ditzy.
Mhm.
I'm not going to do it anymore. She said, I don't know, right, good, you know. And then she went on and had a really good career. You know, she became a top reporter on Sky News, you know. And many years later, I was in my office in Broadcasting House and the knock on the door and this face appeared and she said, you remember me? I'm the dumb brunette. She said, you know. And anyway, the point of the story is I said something spontaneously and rudely. It just happened to be the thing she was ready to hear,
Mhm.
you know.
Mhm.
And so this is why, you know, being effective is to some extent a lottery, you know, because you need to say difficult things to people.
Mhm. Mhm.
But if you can, it's almost impossible. Work out what it is they're ready to hear.
Yeah, for me, that's not at all tangential. Sorry to contradict you. I mean, that's spot on what I'm interested in, because for me, that's kind of behavior. And one of the ways we behave is we talk and we listen. And that's a great example of saying something that the other person at that time seemed to find useful. I mean, do you think there were other things, or have there been other things in your career that have created the kind of context for that to land right? Or was it really just chance?
Um, there've been I don't know if I say a lot, but quite a few similar things. You know, I
Mm,
was at a BBC memorial service a few months ago, and um, Fergus Walsh came up to me. He's the medical editor, you know, and he said, "I'll always remember what you said to me when you first appointed me." I have no idea what was it, and he said the thing we're about most of all is accuracy, you know, and so that stuck.
yeah. Again, similarly, you said something that was powerful at that moment and then
Yeah, I mean,
stuck.
yeah, for me, it's just an ordinary, you know, thing,
Thing to say, yeah.
obvious thing to say, you know.
Yeah.
But and I tell you, an odd thing too is that I've several times been stopped by people. Sometimes people I can't remember who they are, you know, um, who've said that I'd given them advice about other matters, you know, that I can't remember it at all, you know,
Mhm,
but it
mhm,
stuck with them
mhm.
time, you know. So, and the important point is I can't remember it, and I certainly never intended it to be a particularly significant moment in these people's lives, just ordinary stuff, you know.
Sure, sure. And again, I'm going to push a little bit. I mean, I'm still curious. I mean, um, you mentioned BBC News Online, other places where there were kind of teams of people, large groups of people. Do you think there was something about the way you behaved there that tried to make it possible to say those kind of things? Something about a context or a culture or something like that?
Well, I think,
And if so, what were you doing that made it
yeah,
possible?
yeah. Well, I'm uncomfortable talking about this because it's it's about honesty, and I always think when somebody starts talking about honesty, you should check if your wallet's still in your pocket.
Yeah.
Um, but I think you can be a manager in many ways, and I've had managers who believe that all information is power, and you should withhold information. And that's not quite the same thing as honesty. That's more to do with candor, which is a different thing. But I think that if when you talk to people, they know that you're trying to tell them the truth, and you're not going to say anything that's false. Um, and sometimes I've gone too far in this area, and you can become blunt and offensive, easy to do. But the main thing is that you uh, can be relied on when you
Mhm.
talk to speak honestly to them. And I think preferably uh, against a background that they think you're essentially kind rather
Mhm.
than rather than unkind or vindictive or something.
Mhm.
So anyway, I don't want to boast about that because it's
Mhm.
because we're all economical with the truth sometimes, even if
Mhm.
and
Mhm.
I can think of many occasions, well, many perhaps an exaggeration, but I'd be told we're gonna go through a period of cuts now, and your department's going to lose 50%, and I think, oh dear, and and then it wouldn't happen, you know, and so in all future occasions, I'd hear this and I'd just keep it to myself. I wasn't going to tell people,
Mhm.
we probably wouldn't have to make them, and if we did, then we'd face it. And maybe I'd run the risk of if it did happen, I'd be unprepared or not well prepared as I could have been. But it just seemed like unnecessarily worrying to people to be excessively candid. Sometimes it's just one example.
Mhm.
So I think if you just try to be straight with people,
Mhm.
and they
Mhm.
think that even if you tell them off, that essentially you're kindly disposed towards them.
Yeah.
And I think that helps.
Yeah. That kind of background of kindness and so forth. And it also sounds like you're constantly trying to make a practical judgment, as you say, because it can go one way. You can be too honest, you can be veer into being blunt. And then at other times you have to retain information to yourself rather than just kind of blurting it out. Again, from that perspective. So are you conscious of that kind of judgment that you're making
Oh,
when you
acutely,
acutely? Okay.
because sometimes you know that you've whatever your intentions, you've got it slightly wrong, and the person in front of you bursts into tears.
Mm, mm,
So, um, so yeah, it's about. I suppose it's all about communication.
mm, mm,
Um, we're all patchy in our communication skills.
mm,
Yeah? Um, but what I think is there was a time in the BBC when we were all made to go, not all, but senior people in BBC News were made to go to have a consultation with the BBC doctor. The BBC had a medical department, a bunch of doctors in those days, and the head doctor was somebody who was very interested in stress, and we all had to go and be interviewed by her about how much stress we were under. It was a ridiculous conversation. At the end of it, she said to me, well, you're under tremendous stress, and I have to tell you, there's a high likelihood that you'll become seriously ill within 18 months. She said. I realized at this point this was just bonkers. But anyway, what she did say more usefully was I was having trouble with my boss at the time, and she said, well, I can see this is tricky for you. The thing to remember is if you lose respect in your boss, there's actually no going back. It's never going to get any better, you know. So that's an important thing to remember, that you need to earn and retain people's respect if you're going
mm,
to be able to, because I don't particularly want to exercise authority over people, you know. And that's why the media is good in this respect, because certainly not the military, where you have to obey orders. There are situations where if you don't obey a legitimate instruction, you can be disciplined or fired or whatever, But it's not that hierarchical power is not such a big thing in the media. And if you have somebody who's in power and they say, okay, what we're going to do in the 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock news tonight is this, and the most lowly person present in the meeting says, actually, wouldn't it be better if we did this? Then the quality of the idea is going to be what you hope is going to be what decides what happens. So the exercise of power in the, I don't think of it in these terms, and it sort of feels if you do think of it in these terms, you're going to get it wrong, because it's going to be clumsy,
You can overthink it.
Yeah, and sometimes you have to say to people, well, okay, we'll have to, we think differently about this, but this is what we're going to do. And then on those occasions, you are using your hierarchical power. Those things do happen, but you don't want those things to happen. You want to avoid that if you can.
There's lots more I want to talk to you about, but I want to ask just before we do some of that. So you mentioned your bosses. So in relation to kind of upwards, and say a little bit about that if you can, but and also about politics, this idea of a small p kind of organizational politics. How have you navigated that? Because I know you have worked for some very senior people.
Yeah. Two aspects to that question then, really, right? Is how do you deal with your bosses?
Yeah.
How do you deal with office politics?
Mm.
I think it's important to know what you're good at, and it's even more important to know what you're not good at. And I'm not a disaster at managing up, but I'm not particularly good at it. I see people who are better than me at managing up, and that's more true of the politics. I can exist in polite society, but I see people, colleagues in the BBC, are much better at handling tricky, small p political situations than I am, and I don't really, it's not some. I don't want to turn my mind to becoming good at those things. I mean, it's too late now anyway, but I didn't, I didn't want to become good at those things. And if you've got people around you who are your bosses who you trust, and they can do those things,
Yeah.
Nobody has everything, And I was, on balance, really very lucky, very, very lucky with my bosses who were indulgent of me when I was being an idiot, and very supportive of me. And so, I mean, I think it's the same answer to the two questions. That, I acknowledge that I certainly was not the best at managing upwards. I think I was okay at managing downwards. Upwards and downwards is offensive, but you framed the question, And the politics I should keep out of, I'm going to make a big mess out of it, through impatience or being an idiot,
Okay. All right. So you were with the BBC till around the turn of the century, is that right?
Yeah.
And then after that, you went off and you did some freelancing stuff, and you've also set up some organizations and worked for USAID, amongst others, I believe. So what about media in the world? I mean, what relevance does media in the world have to healthy power, would you say, if any?
Well, where you look at a country and simply from, reading the papers every day, you know that the country is not in a generally very healthy state. You can be pretty certain that the media is not in a very generally healthy state there anyway. And working in the media in developing and post-conflict and transitional countries, there are a few commonalities. The main one is that the problems in the media, generally speaking, not all of them, but the most important problems in the media don't have their origins in the media. They have their origins in the wider politics of the society that they're in. And working with the media, there's a limited amount you can do, a very limited amount you can do to address that issue. So I was working in, because of the terms of my employment, I can't identify countries here. Okay, so I'm not being coy about it. I'm just promise not to identify countries. I was working on one newspaper, and the editor of the newspaper, a nice, intelligent, well-connected man, had 63 cases pending against him brought by the government, 7 of which carried the death penalty. So, and I went to see him again last year, and I said, "How are you doing?" And he said, "Oh, I'm not too bad." I said, "Last time I talked to you, you had 63 cases against." He said, "It's 74 now." And, so, in another occasion, I was in a country, they're all desperately short of everything, basically, especially technology. I was in a country where not me, but somebody had managed to get organized a gift of laptops. And they were sitting in this national broadcaster's store and had been for 6 months. I said, why don't you roll them out, give them to the staff, they're struggling. He said, I can't. I said, why not? I said, because I might end up in prison if I do. So why do you accept them? He said, well, we're waiting for permission to hand them out, And so these people are just in the direst situation you can imagine, really. I mean, some of them, one of the poorest countries in the world I worked in, that the very state of the building would break your heart, It's just dreadful, And you work in, where the main studio, the control room, the vision mixer doesn't work. They have no talk back to the studio. They only have 3 cameras in the whole national broadcaster, and 2 of those are broken or don't work very well, And so you're doing what you can, but you don't really have very much power. And
no. But presumably you're doing it because you do think it's worthwhile.
Oh yeah.
So what is it that, I mean, I was expecting you to say, yes, media is kind of very important in, the way societies operate or something like that.
What you have to accept, and if you don't accept it, you pretty soon find it out from experience, is that you go in for 2 weeks, 3 weeks, whatever it is, and you fill the heads of the workforce with all kinds of good ideas, you hope, and then you leave. You don't have to expect that you're leaving behind a transformed place, because if any change happens at all, first of all, you should be very grateful there's any change. The likelihood is that it'll be implemented for a little while and then they'll revert to the status quo because the circumstances are very different. Often they're being paid. And so what you're trying to do is plant a seed and sometimes get practical help, So I was working in one place where they'd switched to all digital production, even though there are hardly any digital tools. But the network around the building, which everything went through, was ridiculously hopeless and useless. And there were 75 terminals and only 34 of them worked, on the network. So I thought that I could probably get funding for a new network, which at least give them the basis to move pictures and audio around the place, So I did. I got funding, for a fiber network around the building. And when I went back 6 months later, they had a new network that was working. Now, it wasn't fiber. Okay, it was Cat 6. Why isn't it fiber? Oh, well, it was thought better that, that. I don't know why it wasn't fiber, but I have my suspicions why it wasn't fiber, So anyway, you're doing what you can in difficult circumstances, and you're trying to plant the seeds of good practice. But there's a very long way to go in all of these cases before, ideally, government should be more afraid of newspapers and the press than the newspapers are of the government. And that's why the current administration in the United States is so hard on the press, because they know in America, the press has brought the president down in the case of Watergate,
Mm.
and so they're trying to emasculate the press. And in these countries where one goes on aid projects, the press are much more frightened of the government than the government is of them,
Mm.
and so
Okay.
you're trying to do what you can to stiffen their resolve.
Okay, that's brilliant. I love that idea of kind of planting seeds as well. And it sounds, in a way, it sounds very similar to a lot of things that have happened across your life. You've been planting seeds with people, and then things happen much later, and you don't always know, do you? And the context is kind of important in the same way. We're,
Yeah,
we're kind of heading towards the time where we need to kind of wind up. I just wanted to give you the opportunity to kind of add anything else you wanted to add in kind of relation to healthy power as you think about that kind of concept. Is there something else you'd like to say?
well, we haven't talked much about the BBC News website,
Hmm.
which you also know about. That's perhaps why
Hmm.
we haven't talked about it. But,
Hmm.
one thing that, by the way, this thing about planting seeds, it's not a one-way, it's not a one-way process.
Hmm.
That's the point. People are planting seeds with me, including you today,
Mm.
all the time. So it's sort of well, it's bilateral,
Yeah, yeah.
multilateral planting of seeds. When we were planning to make the BBC News website, as you know, we did not have the technology or the expertise or the skills. We didn't know what we were doing. And we hired a small group of people, almost all of whom came from the Times online team. You remember them.
Hmm.
Um, and so we were bringing in, I don't know, 5, 6, 7 people from the outside world, nearly all of whom were in their 20s. There might have been one poor old chap who was in his 30s, but they were a young bunch. And I thought Mike Smart and I were kind of planning the thing the editor was going to be the editor, were planning the thing at this point. And we thought, we know what BBC News should be, because we both have between us more than 50 years experience of doing it. We didn't need to discuss that with each other. We knew what it was going to be. We know what the values of BBC News were. And we're bringing in these young people from outside. And we thought, what are we going to have to do to give these people a sense of the values of the BBC and the BBC News, so we didn't know what to do. Not that we had a plan. I wouldn't like to claim that, but we brought them in and we started sitting down at meetings with them and talking to them, and we realized they already knew. They'd assimilated it, through their pores. You had too, because of your age.
Hmm. Hmm.
They'd grown up. They were just nowadays, I presume this is not true. My grandchildren don't watch the BBC, use the BBC at all, but they knew what BBC News was about. They couldn't necessarily have written an essay about it, but they knew. They got it. So this is a tremendously important thing about media literacy. We didn't need to train these people. They already knew. And then when we sat down at meetings with them, and we're talking about what to do, there came this moment. There's another of these accidental. I don't know if you were there. There's an accidental moment of importance, because they asked, well, look, when we got to make a decision about something, about how we're going to make this website, on what basis are we going to make the decision? And I sort of looked at Mike Smart and he looked at me. Well, we're going to decide on what the best thing is to do for the benefit of the users to make this product the best product it can be. At this moment it just seemed otious, it's the obvious thing to say. It turned out to be transformational, because they'd come from a different kind of working atmosphere, and they suddenly thought, this is how it should be.
Hmm.
They told us this, and so we completely stumbled onto this, and they initiated it, not me and not Mike, and it cleared the way for the kind of relationship in the team in which the quality of the ideas was what mattered, not the seniority of the person
Hmm.
speaking,
Hmm.
So it was a transference of power, if you like. I really
Hmm.
don't like using this word, by the way.
Hmm.
I think you should in your heading, the healthy parallax, you should put P asterisk 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 asterisk. Much better. Anyway, it was a peaceful transference of power to the team who actually knew more about it than we did, and that was how it worked.
Thank you. And the transference of power to a purpose in some sense. Is that right?
Well, I think almost everything that I've been doing has been end related, really.
Yeah.
And I've read a bit about Eastern philosophies and so on, and the importance of the means whereby, and I discount all that stuff, but there are, you need some the reason society makes progress is not just because of spiritual enlightenment, it's because of achieving objectives. And that's everything I've ever done, I think, has been about achieving objectives.
Thank you. And thank you so much. It's been enlightening, really great to talk to you. I really appreciate it. And thank you for coming. Good to see you again. Lovely to see you again.
Thank you.
For everybody out there, we're going to be releasing some new episodes soon. You'll hear those in your normal podcast player. But Bob, thank you again. Lovely to have you here today.
My pleasure. Great to talk to you, Peter.